evening. Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I'd first like to invite you to take out your phones, turn them off, turn the ringer off. I know I forget sometimes to do that too. It's wonderful to see you all here tonight. I expect other people may be coming in as we start, and just make room for them if you can. It's so wonderful to have you here tonight. Miles Orvell won the 2021 Athenaeum Art and Architecture Award, and then we promptly closed down for renovation. So we won it. We announced it in early 2022. And we promptly closed down for renovations, and when we reopened, somehow we never managed to schedule him in 2023. So we were a little chagrined, but also delighted when he said yes, he would be happy to come and talk at the Athenaeum as part of that award winner. So we're so delighted to have him here tonight. If this is your first time at the Athenaeum to visit us, we are not just this beautiful, amazing building, but a lively and warm community of people of all ages who love to learn together, who are curious about art and history and architecture, about Philadelphia and culture and one another, who love movies and music and creativity. All, if you are not a member, to consider becoming a member. If you're not sure, please stay for the reception afterwards and talk to some of our members and ask the questions you want to know about what it means to be a part of the Athenaeum. We would love to have you. But tonight I am delighted to welcome Miles Orvell, who is Professor of English and American Studies at Temple University. His publications have ranged from literary criticism to broader studies of American culture. He's the author of 10 books, including an early book on Flannery O'Connor, followed by The Real Thing, Imitation and Authenticity in American Culture, which was a study of technology and culture that was the co-winner of the American Study Association's John Hope Franklin Prize, about the biggest award you can get in American studies. The Death and Life of Main Street, Small Towns in American Memory, Space, and Community was a finalist for the Zocalo Public Square Book Prize for Best Book published on community and social cohesion in 2013. He's also the founding editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia of American Studies from 1998 to 2011, the recipient of several NEH awards and of the Bode Pearson Prize in American Studies for Lifetime Achievement. I also found that he's an author on a website about Sunnyside, a neighborhood in New York where he grew up, and it is I kind of got lost on that site and all the stories that people would tell of growing up there, from little mock weddings in 5th grade to being red diaper babies. It's a lovely site, so I encourage you to look that up. But tonight we're here to hear him talk about his Athenaeum Art and Architecture award-winning book, Empire of Ruin: American Culture, Photography, and the Spectacle of Destruction. And I encourage you to join me now in warmly welcoming Miles Orvell to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Thank you, Beth, for that warm and mostly true introduction. The untrue part is that I recently retired, so I'm actually not still a professor at least, and when I mentioned my plan to retire to a colleague who knew I'd written this book, he said, "Oh, that's good, because now your career is in ruins." Someone said I should begin with a joke. They forgot to add a good joke, but anyway. Also, having this opportunity now, several years after the book was written and came out, is wonderful for me to be able to review it and wonder who wrote this book, and you know the way that is sometimes. So I'm very excited to be talking about it, and I'm going to be following basically the structure of the book in my talk tonight. But I've also taken the opportunity to expand and extend it because I realize that my thinking about ruins has changed even in the last few years. I won't say any more than that for now. But in any case, beginning now with this opening set of slides, you're probably wondering that I have juxtaposed Goethe, who is reminiscing and thinking about the past, with this very striking and disturbing image of some people who are looking at a present ruin, but, well, not paying attention. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but it's just really raises the whole question, which is the center of my talk, which is how do we look at ruins? What do they mean to us? That is basically what this is about. And I'm dividing my talk into 4 sections because I think that there's a historical narrative here, which is that we look at ruins of the past in a particular way, and historically there's been this change in the whole evolution of how people have looked at ruins and what they have meant. So I'm dividing this into the ruins of the past, the present, the future, and finally a coda. This is, in terms of methodology, you might say a visual historiography. That is, I'm using images to understand culture and talking about history and images in this way. These are Dziga Vertov images just to provide a kind of striking idea of what the camera meant. And this is partly going to be a talk about the whole impact of the camera on our visualization of ruins. So beginning with ruins of the past, I want to begin actually with some non-photograph material. This is actually a copy John Adams owned, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and this copy was passed around. The whole idea of America being modeled on Rome was, of course, a very powerful one for the revolutionary generation. And along with that meant the question, would we too decline and fall? So that becomes a kind of profound worry, you might say, for the generation during this period. And in fact, Jefferson, we know, wrote in his copy something from the apocryphal poem, Ocean. I have seen the walls of Vaucluse, but they were desolate. They have fallen before us. For one day we must fall. And the image here that I expanded is the image of someone on a broken column looking at the ruins of the past and thinking about the repetition of this idea of decline. Can it happen again? Do great countries fail? That was the lesson of Rome. And another person who was meditating on this same problem a little bit later was the Marquis de Volney. And Jefferson was interested in this argument as well. In fact, he engaged to translate it and did so for about 20 chapters before he gave it up to run for president. But the same idea here, and you can see in the expanded detail, the same kind of illustration of someone sitting, contemplating the ruins, trying to decipher the meaning of the ruins of the past. Thomas Cole took this idea to its greatest height aesthetically in his wonderful series of 5 paintings, The Course of Empire. Here we see the whole portrayal of a cyclical narrative of history, beginning in the savage state, moving to the pastoral, and then to the height, the consummation of empire. Where are we going from there? Destruction, desolation. So here the cyclical pattern plays out in these 5 images. And Cole did this and portrayed this because he was worried about exactly this possibility, that America, this new country in the 1830s, could decline and fall. Well, there are many theories of history, so I would just simplify them to keep in the back of our minds now. And one is this cyclical rise and fall of civilizations. Another is the idea that the Golden Age existed in the past. Another is that the Golden Age exists, or will exist rather, in the future. And the one that we're going to see toward the end of my talk, the apocalyptic notion of an end of the world. This is the Wheel of Fortune represented from a medieval manuscript, and it looks like Fortuna, the goddess, is trying to explain things to this person who is wondering, what's going on? This is it. So the classical ruins were of great interest in the 19th century for Americans, and a very interesting figure, William James Stillman, went to Greece and made a wonderful series, one of the first full treatments photographically of the Acropolis, portraying it as a kind of idealized but very detailed ruin. But there were not only the ruins of ancient classical civilization, there were the ruins of Central America to be discovered. And this happened around 1840, before Stillman even was going to Greece. John Lloyd Stevens and this wonderful illustrator, Frederick Catherwood, he took a camera, but the camera didn't work. It was too humid. It was around 1841. And so fortunately, he was a great artist, and he came back with these very detailed and dramatic drawings of the civilizations that were being seen for the first time by Europeans who were exploring these regions. And sometimes they saw these ruins under the guise of their own sort of romantic fantasies. Here, Benjamin Norman portrayed it in ways that are not unlike Turner's portrayal of the actual ruins in Egypt, as you can see. Later on in the century, a British photographer took some wonderful photographs, and he's there actually standing in the ruin there on the right, and this is one of his images there that he took of the Chichen Itza ruins, which were again being newly discovered. But it wasn't just Central America, it was also the southwest of the United States that was being discovered. Now, of course, I'm speaking ethnocentrically, of course, discovered by white people who didn't know it existed, but, well, gee, there's something out there you should look at. Someone mentioned to William Henry Jackson in 1874, he went out there with a couple of pals, and he took this photograph of one of the earliest seen ruins in that region, in the Canyon of the Mancos. Timothy O'Sullivan, a year earlier, had traveled on a geological expedition, and he also photographed the Canyon de Chelly. These were amazing images which were used in terms of just revealing the geology, but they were images that raised very interesting questions for people about the current occupants in this area, the Native Americans, the indigenous populations. Americans at that time did not want to, that is, white Americans, accept the idea that the present Indians occupying these areas had the ability to build these cliff dwellings in the past. That couldn't be because they were so poor, they seemed to be not capable of this. So there was an interesting idea, well, how does this fit into the American story? Is this part of us? Is it not part of us? This is a whole episode in American cultural history. I should say these slides are, you're getting a very quick narrative here. So all of these ideas, slides, the book. Much more detail there. Okay. Laura Gilpin, photographer of the early 20th century, also photographed some of the same images. And here you can see that her intention is not documentary as it was for, let's say, O'Sullivan and Jackson. She is putting a kind of romantic aura on these images and, even putting them together into a kind of pictorial postcards gathering of these images. So the idea of the Southwest culture of the indigenous tribes was entering American culture in the early 20th century, say about 40, 50 years after the first discovery, as almost an ideal of a kind of culture. And Willa Cather writes about this, of course, in The Professor's House, when Tom Outland discovers that area and writes about it as an ideal of simplicity and folk culture that is opposed to the commercial civilization. This is a fake ruin built by the wonderful architect Mary Coulter, who was the most important architect of this period in this area, who modeled her constructions, which were very solidly built, modeled them on the archaic ruins of this area. Turning to the ruins of the present, now I'm looking at ruins that were occurring not in the past to be discovered, but rather ruins that could actually be taking place before the eyes of the individual at that time. And photography comes along in 1839 and becomes the chief means by which ruins could be documented and imagined. So the cameras, of course, were very big, as on the left here, Jackson's camera, or the handier camera that Jack London is carrying there. The difference was that photography changed the way that these things could be pictured. Instead of drawing, they were produced by machine. Instead of the generalized artist portrayal, it was the literal portrayal of the camera. The detail was visible. Instead of the subjectivity of the artist, it was the objectivity of the photographer. Instead of a recollection in memory, it was happening in real time. And of course, with photography, you had the potential to multiply the reproductions and disseminate this information. So in the past, you had drawings of someone sort of contemplating, but this is interesting because the same trope of a contemplation of ruins is now used by a photographer to picture the Civil War ruins. Individuals sitting there amidst the ruins in a photograph by George Barnard. And even some of the classical architecture of the period is photographed in ways that make it almost look like ancient ruins. One of the best examples of the actual, at the moment, portrayal of ruins is this photograph by Arnold Genth of San Francisco in the earthquake. He borrowed a camera from someone, ran out there and took this famous photograph of people sitting in the street watching it happen at this time. So photography makes possible the idea that ruins are part of our present experience, not just something that's happened in the past. More photographs by Genth of this party of people who seem to be just enjoying themselves picnicking. Other photographers came out. Photographing ruins became an occupation. But not only were they pictured for journalistic purposes, but also, as in these photographs by Stellman, they could be made to look like the ancient ruins. So you could have the actual ruins of the day, but even impose upon them this image of classical antiquity. Other new technologies were coming in that enabled visualizing the city in broader terms. bird's eye view of San Francisco after the earthquake. My bridge on the top slide, top of the slide had used a panoramic array of photographs, put together three to create this image, and it's sort of mirrored by the image of catastrophe below it. These are stills actually taken from one of the earliest films, 1901, picturing the demolition of the Star Theater in Manhattan. So the Star Theater begins on the left, and it is demolished gradually, taken apart by a demolition team, and it could be photographed by a camera, and then you could see the whole thing happening in this way. What's happening here in the demolition is a new idea about how to create ruins. You create ruins in order to destroy what's there and build something new to replace it and make more money. So this is called, by Schumpeter, who gave it the name, creative destruction. This is the essence, the core of what capitalism is. It's destroying the old to create the new. And this works itself out in terms of the urban fabric, of course, very deliberately in Manhattan, as pictured by Bernice Abbott. You can see the earlier buildings in the foreground and the taller, newer buildings in the background. You see this wonderful example of Penn Station, one of the great buildings, which was in the 60s demolished in order to make room for whatever that is, that Penn Station on the lower right. So the Majesty of McKim, Mead, and White disappears, and actually what you discover in that photograph on the far right by Norman McGrath is that underneath the column and inside the column is a steel girder. So there's a kind of fake facade of classicism, shrouding that. This is one of the most famous images of creative destruction, not in terms of the capitalist motive, but simply an admission that things are not working in public housing in St. Louis. And so the spectacle of destruction is one of the most powerful images in really American cultural urban history. Vincent Feldman, who couldn't be here tonight, unfortunately, is a Philadelphia photographer who's done a very good, wonderful book on abandoned cities. And these are two of his images, because now we're beginning to see in the 1960s, 70s, post-war America, we're beginning to see not the creative demolition, but the abandonment of properties. So we're beginning to see properties that are simply left to fall apart. And this becomes a fascinating thing for photographers to engage in. Another, well, used to be Philadelphia photographer, Matthew Christopher, has done a whole series of books on abandoned America. Malls, houses, every conceivable subject matter. Creating imagery that has fascinated a whole generation of people looking at ruins and wondering what they see in it as a record of mortality, the mortality of cities, the destruction of material culture, the abandonment of things that are left to decay. There's so many things going on here again in the book. Andrew Moore, another great photographer of Detroit. Detroit becomes the poster city for this whole process, for complicated reasons and economic reasons, obviously. But the surreal aspect of photography is brought out in so many books about Detroit, and many books have been written about Detroit ruin photography. French photographers, Marchand and Meffre, came over, and here they are walking, the only image of them that we have in this book, walking through abandoned factories and creating these wonderfully engaging pictures of ruins that are turned into a kind of aesthetic spectacle. Camila Jose Vergara, another great contemporary documentary photographer, has spent a lot of time in this area: Camden, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit. What Vergara has also done, unlike any other photographer, he has created a sequence of images, well, I should say many, many, many sequences of images of sites where he has gone back to the same place, photographed it one year, the next year, the next year, the next year, so that we can track from the upper left across, we can see the gradual decay of a structure before our eyes in this kind of time-lapse photography. And then, in some places, if you carry it far enough, you can see the neighborhood beginning to come back again. Vergara donated over 100,000 photographs to the Library of Congress, so they're very easily accessible if you're interested in tracking this whole effort. And this series, this project is called Tracking Time. Inspired, no doubt, by Muybridge, you cannot expect the buildings to gallop, but the inspiration of sequential photography is there, kind of time-lapse imagery that I call chronotopography. Another photographer who photographed the transformations of neighborhoods, this time in the Lower East Side, gives us an image in 1973 of the World Trade Center. We're more familiar with images like this of the World Trade Center and of people looking at it and trying to absorb it and trying to make sense of it as an event that's happening at the time, and of course we've been trying to make sense of it ever since. While it was happening, one of the great documentary photographers, James Nachtwey, made this picture, which has obviously a kind of symbolic, almost theological point to it. And here is the Hopker image, which was so shocking at the time when Hopker looked at it that he did not even think of ever publishing it. It was not published until 5 years later, because it showed people seemingly nonchalant in the face of this catastrophe. But again, it raises the question which we can talk about now, and that is, how should we experience ruins, catastrophe, when it is part of our living present? And Hopker, when he published this, explained, this image is not representative. They were looking at what was happening, but he happened to capture a moment when they were not looking at it and seemed to be just having a picnic or something. So, again, interesting representation. Nachtwey, again, was there to make photographs of the destruction, but the great photographer of the World Trade Center, who pictured it in color during the period of its cleanup, the aftermath, is Joel Meyerowitz. And what's interesting about Meyerowitz's work is the aesthetic dimension of it, which is something that he was aware of while it was happening. And he writes about seeing these images in terms of painting, images by painters that he had seen and was reminded of when he was seeing. So the whole aestheticizing of disaster is something that I'm very interested And you could say that the reason he was able to, and the reason we are able to see these images aesthetically in a way, relates to the whole transformation of art in the 20th century as a result of Cubism and the whole fragmentation of the image and the disruption of the image. Gertrude Stein said it very well when she spoke in a purely aesthetic sense in saying, the earth has a splendor that it never has had, and as everything destroys itself in the 20th century, and nothing continues, so then the 20th century has a splendor, which is its own, and Picasso is of this century. He has that strange quality of an earth that one has never seen, and of things destroyed as they have never been destroyed. I move now to the ruins of the future. So what I mean by that is there are some ruins that are occurring obviously here in 1945, 1950s, during the beginnings of the atomic bomb explosions and testing. There are images that are being witnessed by people who are realizing at the time they are witnessing them that this is not just something happening in the present and that's it and we're going to rebuild. This is not something that happened in the past, obviously. This is something that is happening in the present, and it is quite possibly the future of the planet. We're looking at the potential for a future of ruins, which is what is being pictured in a variety of ways here. Some of these images are quite amazing to think of, just almost the performance of the explosion and people watching it in this way. James Light collected these wonderful, amazing images in his book, 100 Suns, accenting how aesthetic they are. You can buy these as art posters. Are they beautiful? What does it mean for them to have an aesthetic character? And this is where, in the book, I developed this idea of the destructive sublime, a new type of sublime. Not the traditional one, and not even the technological sublime, but a sublime that's based upon the enormous destructive power of the atomic bomb and of other things that we witness in contemporary life. These images came out in Life magazine and were different from the atomic bomb. It was not the familiar mushroom. It was something even scarier. These images were not shown at the time. They were suppressed by the United States Army during the occupation until 1952 because they were too terrible. The Army did send teams of people to Nagasaki and Hiroshima to document the effects of the bomb, but they didn't want these things widely known. One of the great architects of the late 20th and 21st century, of course, is Arata Isozaki. And he won the Pritzker Prize finally at the end of his career. He began as a kind of theoretical architect, you might say. And this is one of his murals, a photo mural called Re-Ruined Hiroshima. He was 14 years old and living there when the bomb exploded. He became obsessed with it. And in 1968 produced a mural of the massive annihilation and destruction with this idea that the future will be a repetition of ruins and construction and ruins and construction. And so he calls it Re-Ruined Hiroshima. And he wrote in another drawing that he did very early in his career, before he was famous. Incubated cities are destined to self-destruct. Ruins are the style of our future cities, and future cities are themselves ruins. Our contemporary cities, for this reason, are destined to live only a fleeting moment, give up their energy, and return to inert material. Leah Modigliani, is she here? Yes, Leah. Hi, Leah. Did this amazing photo mural called "The City in Her Desolation," in which she pictures a sequence of images put together without any transition, a kind of seamless record of destruction that accentuates the almost blind destruction of the city in the 20th century. For whatever reason, continuous and unending. It's a wonderful series. Hurricane Katrina, another source of urban destruction, pictured by Robert Polidori, another great documentary photographer, who brings out the extraordinary surreal strangeness of what was happening there afterwards and what was left in the ruins of the time. He does something else which we haven't seen before in the documentary study of ruins, and it may seem almost voyeuristic, and that is he enters the houses and photographs close up with a very big view camera. Lots of detail there, what's happening and what has happened over time in houses that were flooded, where what you're seeing are the remains left over. Hurricane Sandy, also a mark of climate ruins that we're experiencing in many different ways. James Balog has done an amazing sequence of images put together in different ways, including the film Chasing Ice, which documents his effort to record the shrinking ice cap in the Arctic. And he does it through time sequence photographs and through exact measurements, so that he can depict the orange line, for example, where the glacier was, and a certain number of years later, what it has shrunk to. So if you don't believe in climate change, you need to see Balog's photographs, which is why he took them. He took them at a time when people were challenging the whole idea, and using photography and its ability to record to make the point valid. Popular culture has picked up on all of these disaster themes, of course. Towering infernos and earthquakes and flooded cities, frozen cities, and Roland Emmerich has done some of the most interesting ones, I think, Day After Tomorrow, and 2012, which I love because it's so amazingly zany and preposterous in its whole premise and working out. These are images from those two movies. And the poster for 2012 reminded me of Caspar David Friedrich's Wander Above the Sea of Fog, one of the classic, great romantic images of the early 19th century, embodying this figure who is looking, we don't know what he's looking at, this feeling of the sublimity of nature and the mystery and the searching of the soul for some kind of romantic truth. The image is evocative for Emmerich, and he stages his film, I think, to allude to it with this very obvious irony of how disaster has completed the cycle. These comparisons come easily. Edward Bertinsky, the wonderful Canadian photographer, has spent his career documenting the transformations of the earth under the influence of oil and water and industrial waste, as here, and I just put them against Albert Bierstadt's imagery to dramatize the awful, terrible beauty of these things when they're turned into aesthetic objects like photographs. And we can look at them as, what a beautiful photograph. But wait a second, this is terrible what we're looking at. So that complexity of our response is one of the things that I'm very interested in developing in the book. So, other images of toxic waste, of urban destruction, Centralia, Pennsylvania, the Love Canal, these are some of the more famous ones, but we see them more and more as images not just of the present, but of the future. The decay and destruction or self-destruction of the infrastructure of bridges. We became aware of it very dramatically in 2014 with the Skagit River Bridge collapsing near Seattle. And in 2007, the I-35 in Minneapolis. These look like stills from disaster movies. And again, the infrastructure is decaying as we sit here, and it's a major problem for this country to solve. Looking at these ruins from a distance, we can only imagine these sentiments and feelings of consternation on the part of people who are looking at it. It's a very, very different image from the one that Lloydse proposed in his 1862 painting. Lloydse pictures the exploration and the optimism, going west, fulfilling what was thought of as the manifest destiny of this country. Now, here's what we have. So, images of the future have also included images of looking back at the remains of an American civilization that has been imagined to be destroyed in the future. This is a installation by Ellen Harvey called The Alien's Guide to the Ruins of Washington, D.C. And here we see the classical civilization Washington was modeled on, reduced in some future time, as Ellen Harvey imagines it, to ruins being looked at by someone from an alien civilization who is visiting and seeing it as, what is that really complicated pillar thing? What is that long triangle pillar thing? And the circle triangle pillar thing? This is the idea here. This idea of looking back on the present as a ruined future begins much earlier, as a matter of fact. It begins in an image that the historian Macaulay developed when he was writing a review, and imagine that the Catholic Church would still be standing in the future, even when some future New Zealander, who would be the equivalent of an alien from outer space, like someone even from New Zealand would come and look at the ruins of London and contemplate it. And that became a visual trope that comes into, it's the last image in the book London, A Pilgrimage, and it used as a cover image as well here by Gustave Doré. So now I'm just juxtaposing here the sense of America and its eternal present, symbolized by Walt Whitman, and the statue which is called the Open Road, that was at the New York World's Fair in 1939. Just a few years earlier, Stephen Vincent Benet had published a story called The Place of the Gods in the Saturday Evening Post, published up the block here, about someone who comes, who's from some tribe in probably New Jersey, goes to Manhattan, and discovers in one of the old apartment houses there, someone is sitting there looking out the window at the ruins of the city. Some post-apocalyptic image. So the idea of the apocalypse comes into American culture in the 19th century, and it continues through the 20th century. The opposition of the Whitman vision of the future, optimism of America, and this pessimistic vision is one that is very present in the 30s in this way, but continues to this day. Ignatius Donnelly wrote his apocalyptic dystopian novel, Caesar's Column, in 1890. This idea of the apocalypse continues in popular culture through the 20th century. And it is, I'm sorry, pressed the wrong button there. It is an image of the future which opposes these two kind of future ideas of utopia and dystopia. I want to spend a minute on Chernobyl because I became fascinated by it more recently, and this is an image of Chernobyl before the 1986 explosion. And it was really a kind of utopian city. It was built as a kind of workers' paradise for people who worked in the nuclear industry, which was a central industry for, at that time, the Soviet Union. And Chernobyl, of course, is located in what's now Ukraine. And then the explosion occurred, and you could not go near it. You could only approach it by helicopter, and you could only drop sand on it to contain it. Nevertheless, they managed to build a shield around the reactor, which they knew would only last for 30 years. During that time, Chernobyl and the town of Pripyat was occupied what was called a zone of exclusion. You could not go there. It was closed. Of course, people began to go there, and it became a very popular site of dark tourism. But it was a site that some photographers entered and photographed, and it looks like it was abandoned because, well, it was abandoned, but it had this fascination of end of the world as well. Not just an abandoned city, but this was the end of the world. The danger of the radiation. The suddenness of the closing of this place. At a certain point, the right people, fortunately, were asking themselves, well, now what do we do? We have this reactor here. What do we do with it? We can't send this thing into outer space. We can't put it into the mountains someplace. We can't put it into the bottom of a cave. We can't put it into the bottom of the ocean. What do you do with this thing after the 30 years are up, which they were approaching? The answer was, you contain it in this arch, this new arch, a shield that was constructed specially to do this, and it would last 100 years. And that was built over a period of 6 years and completed in 2016. And of course, to do this, you had to build it away from the reactor where it was safe. But then how do you get it on there? Well, they built tracks, and then when it was done, they could move it over to cover the reactor. So this idea of a site of ruin which was covered, shielded, because it was too awful for anyone to look at. This was a new kind of arch, not the Arch of Triumph, commemorating Napoleon's victory, not the Gateway Arch of St. Louis, not the imagined arch of Mussolini, which wasn't built. This was a new arch commemorating defeat and failure, covering up the disasters of technology of the 20th century. So Chernobyl is interesting because I think it opposes these two ideas of utopia and dystopia. Finally, I want to reflect just for a moment or two on the way that ruins are remembered, have been monumentalized at times. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. This was a ruin from World War II that was left standing, preserved as a ruin, as a memory site. This was Hiroshima, another building that somehow was left standing, became the center of another memory site. The term the French use, lieu de mémoire, is sort of in the back of this, analyzing cultural symbols in terms of their function as sites of memory that collectively bind the nation together, Pierre Nora. We have the World Trade Center Memorial Site, which is a fascinating approach to it in terms of constructing the memory as an absence of the building. And even the light beams that were put up there earlier were an amazing sort of memory of what used to be there. Another way that we remember the past in the face of change and ruins is the miniature. And the miniature railway, for example. These are all kind of nostalgic images. And until recently, there was a place in Pennsylvania, Lawrence Geeringer's Roadside America, that he started in 1935, and he built, it's the size of this room, actually. It was, because it was finally dismantled, but it's the size of this room, an entire kind of representation in miniature of America as a way of holding fixed this memory of what used to be American civilization. We visited that, didn't we? Talking to myself. sun here. Yeah. The whole miniature aesthetic is something that Charles Simmons explored in the 1970s with these tiny models. The one in the upper left was in the staircase of the Breuer building, the museum, and then he would sort of plant these around the city as these mystery places that people would come upon and think, what's going on? It looked like images from the Southwest, from the Pueblo civilizations that he was inserting into the urban fabric as a way of opening up the imagination of the city. The Chinese, I just saw this recently, there's a very popular thing going on now with people being removed from their villages, removed from their homes, and moving into these high-rises. They miss their past homes and their villages. And it began with an artist who was commissioned to build this miniature, and then other artists followed. Many requests followed. Now there's a whole, I think, cottage industry of artists in China who are creating these miniature replicas designed specifically for individuals who lived in these villages and want to remember them as the wave of history washes over them. George Berkeley wrote this poem in 1728, Westward the course of empire takes its way. It's a longer poem. This is just the end of it. The first 4 acts already passed, but his idea was that America was going to be it. Europe was old and it was used up. America was where everything great was going to happen. The first 4 acts already passed. A 5th shall close the drama with a day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. The last, that's something that might be a little bit scary here. Berkeley didn't mean it that way. But we may wonder whether America is nature's nation, this wonderful wilderness of possibility that Bierstadt and the other artists in the 19th century were picturing, or is it a place where technology has dominated in a way that creates what's called second nature? So I wanted to end just with some questions, which I didn't know how to end this talk, really, so I thought, well, I'll ask some questions. Not necessarily that you have to answer these, but these are my questions that I'm asking myself. Can we look to the past for an image of our future? Can we do this? Washington, are we still nature's nation? Can we escape the law of unintended consequences? Can aesthetic distance provide a refuge for us? Miniaturizations. Can the Chernobyl arch be a model for the future? I say this because the Chernobyl arch is a symbol of failure, but it's also actually something that was created by a consortium of banks and an even larger consortium of engineers from all countries. It was a model, in a way, of cooperative action against a potentially very dangerous condition in Europe, at least. So in that sense, a model for how we can survive as well if we were to take, for example, climate change seriously and not fight over who's getting what. And here's a consolation. Out of difficulties grow miracles. Thank you.
Friends, there's a reception there, but let's take 7 minutes for questions, okay? And after that, Miles will be signing books that you can buy here from Head House Books up front, and you're welcome to come and enjoy and continue conversation in the reception hall. If you weren't able to ask Miles questions here, you can ask them there. But right now, I'll take the questions succinct, avoid preamble, and I'll repeat them so everyone can hear, and Miles will answer.
Yes, I'm wondering how you would incorporate the changing notions of evolution and including the mass extinction and so forth that we've learned about in the century that you're talking about into this concept of the empire.
So how to incorporate into the concept of the Empire of Ruins our understandings of evolution as they have changed and emerged over this period of time?
Well, that's a simple question. Thank you. There's a lot there, and I'm gonna try to just very briefly address it and say the extinction problem, of course, is a part of this whole thing. And although my focus was on material culture, the extinction is part and parcel of these changes that we're seeing. The remains of animals and that are extinct and that have surfaced over time are certainly have been incorporated into the whole understanding of ruins. In fact, I didn't show a slide of this, but what's considered to be the first ruin of a building is in Ukraine, not far from Chernobyl, and it consists of the giant tusks of mammoths that were put together into a building, probably maybe 20 feet round or so, covered with hides. So that is part of it. As far as evolution of humankind, and that is imagery which I can't address except in terms of popular culture, because the treatment of the future and the apocalypse is not infrequently in terms of the evolution of Godzilla or this giant thing which has come from underground and comes up. So in a way, that is a very interesting question that opens up the imagery of survival and future apocalypse. I'll just end there.
That's great. So looking at the ruins of like in Detroit and Philadelphia, what constitutes a ruin? For example, potholes. That's a good question.
The decay of cities is visible in many, many ways, and potholes are symptomatic of that. Olmsted's traveled through the South, and he said, you can see the morality of the region by the condition of its roads. And in a sense, that's what the potholes reveal as well. So the infrastructure is visible in all kinds of ways in terms of its decay. There's another question lurking there which I didn't get into, but I'm really interested in it, which is, when does decay become ruin, and when does ruin become rubble? What are the thresholds of transition? This is something that ruinologists have talked about a lot and have written about a lot. That is these threshold questions of, the liminality issues of transition of state from one condition to another. And, at what point do you think, forget it, it's just a rubble? And another thing, no, we need to reconstruct this and rebuild it. So, there are a lot of interesting questions about the materiality of ruins there.
Is it your sense that the pace of ruination has been accelerating over the course of human history, and in particular recent human history, and thinking now about urban ruination?
So has the pace of ruins been increasing or quickening over time, particularly more recently?
Yeah, very definitely. That's a great question, because that's, in the 18th century and the early 19th century, certainly, in America, people are building, they're looking to the future. They were weeping because there were no ruins here. And then in the early 20th century, you begin to get the replacement of buildings by other buildings, and that goes on for a while through the 1930s. And then post-World War II, everything begins to age and fall down, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So yeah, there is an acceleration of ruins just from natural causes of material, that is, falling apart. But in addition, as I was, pointing out in terms of climate change and violence and war and all of these other things that bring about violent change, I would say, yeah, that is why I am saying or claiming, as part of my argument, that the ruins of the future or future ruins are something that we are coming to terms with, or have to come to terms with, as something new, that people did not have to think in these terms. The earliest sign of it is 1945, when they saw that bomb exploding and think, oh my God, what have we done? So this idea of unintended consequences, of not knowing what the results of technology will be, and all the other causes of climate change and so forth. So yeah, very definitely, I think there's an increase there. Yeah.
Take one last question. Here, right in front.
So, what do you think the chances are that the future ruins ends with the final ruin, which is the earth itself?
Wow, I'm going to have to ask another question after this one, because this one has me really depressed. So what do you think that the final end to ruins will be? The total ruination of Earth?
When I think about this, or talk about it with other people, they say, don't worry, there are always going to be insects left, and there are probably going to be an enclave of people out there, Mad Max and his followers someplace. There will always be a few people left to restart. So is that a possibility? I don't know. The planet itself, without human beings, probably will do just fine. So it's really the question of, human beings on this planet. We are the ones who, especially in the past 300 years, have, begun to transform things. And I mean, it's interesting, Thomas Cole began painting that series, The Course of Empire, at a time when technology was hardly visible. But he saw people chopping down the trees in the Hudson Valley. I thought, wait a second, this is not a good sign. So.
Okay, so it was one last question here. Yes.
We're also skeptical, I guess, to feelings of awe and long thoughts about mortality when we look at ruins. But isn't there also an aspect of this being a maudlin preoccupation that implies contempt for the present, cowardly approach to the future?
Okay, so is it awe and wonder when you look at ruins, or is it a maudlin activity to look at ruins? And contempt for the future, right? Is your question? Yes.
Yeah, well, that really gets to the heart of my premise, at least, and because I started out with a very serious aversion to the abundance of ruin imagery in our culture. You notice I haven't used this term ruin porn, and you know, that was a big word for a long time, that, you know, there was this kind of indulgence in ruins and the imagery of ruins, almost a kind of voyeuristic. But, you know, there are many things to say in response here. And one thing I didn't get a chance to say, which is that there is something in this fascination with ruins which is a result of the urge to destruction, the will to destruction. People like to knock things over. People like to destroy things. And I think part of the exaltation aesthetically that we might find in looking or seeing disaster movies or whatever, catastrophes, is this, you know, like deep-seated, I don't want to get psychoanalytic here, but, you know, urge or will to destroy. Henry Miller writes about it. Other people write about it. So it has surfaced in the literature of the 20th century, certainly. Is it a puerile impulse? I don't know, because I think, seriously, if you take climate change seriously, we're talking about a future where we are going to be faced with more and more problems of disaster and the effects of you know, natural change and events that are going to produce ruins. The imagery of Hurricane Sandy and what Sandy did to the New York subway system, if it happened, it can happen again. So I think we, you know, we don't want to face these things, but I think we have to in some way.
Friends, thank you to Miles for a wonderful, wonderful talk. The Athenaeum of Philadelphia's 2021 Art and Architecture Book Award. Thank you. You can buy his book and get it signed over here. If Head House Books runs out of them, I bet they'll order one for you. We have a reception in the reading room for continued conversation. Thank you for joining us. So you might want to walk right around this way.